Welcome, everyone, to another episode of HR and Payroll 2.0. I'm Pete Tiliakis, and as always, I'm joined by the legendary Julie Fernandez. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you, Pete. Great to be here, and
Yep.
we're closing out the year soon enough.
Yeah. And we got a guest this week. I'm so
Yep.
excited. We've got the co-founder and CEO of Work From Anywhere, my good friend John Lee. Welcome, John.
Good to be here, Pete and Julie. Nice to be here with both of you. Looking forward to today's episode.
Yeah, likewise, man. I'm excited. I know for those that don't know, John is my go-to expert for remote work, global employment, and all things related to that subject. And I think it's a very, very fitting, relevant, current, hot topic. I literally before the show Googled return to office, and it was just all kinds of good, bad, and indifferent. So I think there's a lot here we can talk about. And I'm really excited to have you because I know you're out there helping companies make this happen, and you've got some great insights. So good.
Hey, John, I in good faith cannot start a conversation on our podcast without an answer to the burning question: how on earth did you end up in HR payroll? How did you get into this space?
Well, it's interesting for me. I was always passionate about people and different cultures. In fact, my first startup was an intercultural startup, and that's where I got to connect with people in travel and HR, and then would Work From Anywhere. It's in the global mobility, rewards, payroll space. So I just got to meet this wonderful community of people in the payroll space and HR around the world. And I think for me, it's such a beautiful position to be in so many companies that you can literally have such an impact in a really positive way on the lives of literally millions of people. So for me, I'm very, very proud to be part of the community.
Yeah. I assume that's what keeps you here, right?
Exactly.
What could be better?
It's funny, I remember I did a post, like speaking about RTO, you touched on it there earlier, Pete, but I did a post on RTO literally 2 weeks ago, and it was about the Bolt RTO. And somebody responded that you were working in a pharmaceutical company, and a couple of years ago they asked their boss, "Look, could I go back and visit my grandfather back in South Africa?" And they said no. They'd only just joined the company, and they more or less ruled it out. And they went and rebooked the flights a couple of months later, and their grandfather died in the meantime. And I said to myself, wow, as people in HR, as leaders, by some small things that you can do that can transform people. And the other end of the scale, I've heard so many stories of people that got to spend such quality time, with their grandparents, with their loved ones, with their nephews or nieces or sons or daughters, whatever it was, people all around the world. And I think those moments, I think it was Maya Angelou, she said, people might forget what you said, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And for me, I was very close to my grandfather. So when I saw that post, that's the kind of stuff that keeps me in this industry.
Yeah. And that's the kind of crazy stuff you hear that just destroys the employee experience and erodes that trust. And, it's...
what do you do as an employee? If you don't have maybe leave options, that's the other way that folks sometimes handle that, is you have to take a leave. But you don't have any other options. You have to choose between a potential family regret that will stay with you forever and just leaving a new employment experience that you might love.
Here's a question for you both. One of the things is, for me, when a lot of CEOs think, and you could see this from the Bolt CEO, for example, when they think of Work From Anywhere, they think of somebody lazing about by a beach, with a laptop, half working and, with a margarita beside them. But I think that story of spending time with loved ones is really what I'm seeing with companies, what's happening more and more often. So having that as a benefit package, for me, why is that misperception there, I wonder?
Yeah, agreed.
Well, there's probably some of the beachgoers for sure that wreck it for many of us.
Well, I think there's and I want to get into this. I think there's a little bit of an ignorance and maybe even a skills gap in the leadership today that are looking at this and saying, well, that's not what got us here, and I don't know how to manage that, so let's just avoid it. And you're right. There's a lot of awful marketing. I have whipped the EOR industry over this. They created this idea that we're all trying to work from the beach, yet I can't find a CFO or a CEO on a planet that's looking to staff a beach full of people. It's all glamorous and pretty and cute and all that, but it's not reality. But there is a reality in remote work being incredibly effective. And I think you just touched on those intrinsic impacts on the employee's experience and their lens that they're bringing to work that Work From Anywhere or Work From Home can provide. But look, I want to kind of talk about the angst that's out there, right? Like I said, if you were to go right now and just Google return to office and click on the news section of Google, it is pages of bad stories, honestly, around this sort of return to office is a Trojan horse for layoffs. It's just control by the leadership that doesn't understand the sort of modern workplace. It's just on and on, right? But then also there's plenty of great stories. Spotify is a good one, and others who are really having a lot of benefit from this, and it's working really well for them. But what are you seeing, John? Like what are kind of the good and bad out there?
Yeah, well, it's for me. What I'm seeing is, I would say, certainly the startups back in the day, they were, very aggressive on this and seeing it as a way to poach talent from the bigger companies, particularly in certain roles like software engineers, for example. It was a no-brainer. But what we're seeing now is a lot of the other industries are starting to catch up. I would say at an enterprise level, probably half are going, we're active implementing a work from anywhere policy with the technology, whatever they need to make it happen. And maybe half are going, not quite for us just yet, or maybe they want to be a bit more conservative, or maybe they're very heavily regulated companies, like, for example, banks, where they say, look, the risk is just too great, which is also fine as well. It's not for everyone. Yeah. I think the challenge is as well, to be fair, it's also a marketing issue for the employees. I don't see, when people think work from anywhere, think I can actually work from anywhere. I'm sorry, you actually can't. I don't see too many Instagram photos of a beach in North Korea, for example. We all recognize there's logical limitations. So on the one hand, there's communication gap with CEOs misunderstanding what it is, and there's a communication gap sometimes with employees who go on things like hush workations, and that erodes the trust as well. So it's something, trying to look at it holistically. How can we make this into a benefit that becomes a key part of any company's package, but do it in a way that's balanced, that's sustainable, that doesn't throw yourself off the cliff in terms of risk?
Yeah.
You're reminding me something, John, that I knew when I first started in the marketplace in HR, and Hewitt Associates was really big, right? It was the Hewitt Exalt days, and things were taking off and growing, and they were known enough that I actually was applying there at the time to have a sabbatical. And, within the course of 7 years or whatever, you could, then take a year sabbatical and, whatever, further your education or do whatever you wanted to do. And I love the fact that you just mentioned in your commentary that maybe there's a benefits angle to this that should be explored. Because there are situations, the heart-wrenching situations, where there's a need and an employee need, but there's also the advantage that you could create from a benefits perspective.
And that's exactly what we see. So a great resource for anyone here that's looking to explore benchmarks in their industry is a resource called flexa.careers. When you go on it, you can search for companies in your industry and see companies that have a work from anywhere policy, how many days do they offer, what are the benchmarks, and they really position it very, very high as a benefit. So I think one of the things that we do see that's really disappointing at the moment, and I couldn't tell you how many talks I've gone on, and I ask people, hands up if you have a work from anywhere policy. Probably tends to be maybe 75% of companies actually do, but then I ask that 75% and say, how many of you actually measure the ROI of this? Crickets. Hardly any. Mercer did a survey, 93% of companies do not measure the ROI of their work from anywhere policy. So what's fascinating is, if you look at global mobility functions pre-pandemic, who were they looking after? It was expats. It was typically senior executives. It was less than 1% of the employee population. And now they're implementing a work from anywhere policy. It's either payroll teams or leaders doing it, or maybe global mobility or rewards. But they're launching this policy for the whole full global employee population, and they're not measuring the ROI. So again, it does tie back to the RTO, because the amount of companies I've spoken to that actually are pushing RTO, but they're not measuring the data, including Amazon. So the most data-centric company in the world, and they measure data. Anything that moves, it has data measurements attached to it. But for one of the biggest policies, RTO, we just have blinkers on, and let's ignore the data. So I think that's at least my understanding of it. So I think there is, again, that kind of if we at least focus on the objective data points and build something together, focusing on what's right for your company. And it's not about remote work or not, RTO or not. It's focusing on the data. What's best for us.
John, when it comes to data, what a great point. I wonder if, you're talking about measuring the ROI. That's
Hmm.
certainly important. But I wonder if part of the problem, too, is employers struggle with figuring out, how do I measure productivity? Like,
Yeah,
how can I create a use case that says that folks aren't sipping margaritas by the beach
great.
and they are accomplishing their work, especially when you also hear, generations saying, hey, if I can do, a day's worth of work in 3 hours, I should
Yeah.
just be able to get paid for a day's worth of work. Like, all of those messages are conflicting, right? And the measures are key.
It is. And if you look at the measures pre-pandemic, what would we give management out of 10? Probably maybe 5 out of 10, 6 out of 10. You throw the biggest, most complex management change in the world on top of them, they're going to struggle. Pre-pandemic, we were very much input focused, presence in the office, how many hours, etc., volume. Whereas now, there's a shift towards being more output focused. And I think companies do absolutely, Judy, they struggle with that. They really do struggle with that. But if you go into the data piece of this, there are easy ways you can measure this. You can just look at the people that have
Yeah.
taken a workation or didn't. What was the employee satisfaction? What was their productivity? What were their results, for example? You can look at retention. Like Spotify, great example. They reduced attrition by 15%. So you can measure this for that employee population that you did get this benefit and those that didn't. What are we seeing? So there are ways you can look at this in a very objective way to be able to see it very transparently, what is working or not working for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what's interesting? You go back to that Amazon story, right? And it's out there. I think it hit the market this week. They're talking about a 5-day work week again. Okay, whatever. Like I get that a lot of their business, maybe their frontline workers, right? The factory, or not the factory, the distribution centers and things like this. That's not going to be remote. We get that. But with employers already hamstrung with all the layers of complexity with talent, right? There's a shortage of talent, shortage of skills. The skills you need are different. Having to go get them in different locations. There's plenty of data from all over about the fact that organizations can't necessarily find all the talent they need locally. They got to go further. Why wouldn't you be using every means necessary to compete for that? I don't get it. And I listen to what you're saying about Amazon not measuring that, but measuring everything else. And I just hear immaturity and disrespect for that, not respecting that thing. Like, who cares? It's just HR or it's whatever. But like, that just tells me they don't care about that.
Pete, you
Right?
regularly make me groan and think, how do I walk back some of the things?
So,
Well, I mean, I'm I've well documented my opinion, and I've been saying this for probably 3, 4, 5 years, maybe. I think one of the biggest skills gap that we have on the planet are the C-suites that can't manage a hybrid workforce. And I don't get why put up with it? If a board is, I mean, and I'm not saying it's just it's work from home, but like if I'm a board and I'm looking at my leadership and I'm like, why are we not competing? Why are we struggling when our competitor is competing so well? Like, what are you doing? And what do you need to help you get in the game here? And is that maybe the issue? Is it maybe an ignorance or a skill gap? And I don't mean ignorance in a disrespectful way. I mean just not knowing, not understanding, not caring, right? If you don't want to measure it, you obviously don't care about it. So is that maybe the problem, that these leaders just don't know how to manage a hybrid workforce?
But for sure, it's there's no doubt about it. It's a challenge, because you talk to any CEO, any C-suite, they'll talk about ROI, till the cows come home.
Yeah.
But on this, consistently across the board, they don't want to look at it. They're looking the other way. There can be lots of different various motivators for that. And if you look at the case of Amazon, they're in lots of ways, their EBITDA, their profit is probably going to get away with this, because at the end of the day, they're going to be using this as a way to delayer the organization, I suspect. And the productivity improvements they're going to get from AI, deploying that, that will more than probably make up for it. So for me, they'll get away with it in the short run. I would question in the next 5-10 years, is it still going to be the case? I would bet my mortgage that they will not be still doing that in 5-10 years time. And like you said, the talent, it's a global world of talent. Why would you not? You can get, an engineer for, 500K in San Francisco. You can get a really high quality, equally qualified, lots of ways, engineer for a fraction of that in other jurisdictions. So for me, why would you not at least explore that?
Yeah.
So Don, don't you think another thing that I think just practically, like pragmatically, is a challenge for some of these conversations is the idea of compensation maturity. You know, even before you start talking about work from anywhere and something that might be a temporary, you know, situation for someone, it used to be that global mobility and these conversations were reserved for like the top 1%, like you said, or less of the organization. Now, when you start talking about this broadly, you have a whole host of issues that are aggravated. Not only is it already aggravated in companies who don't maybe have a firm grasp of whether their compensation policies or ranges change, you know, from their California employees to their Ohio employees. But now you start talking about globally, you know, what happens when you're making accommodations, and if you don't have a solid grasp of what your compensation structures are and how you approach compensation, it just becomes a big head scratcher, and
Yeah.
companies throw up their hands and go, I don't
Yeah.
want to deal with this,
And
right?
compliance too, right? Like that's
Compliance,
a
yeah.
whole other part of the soup.
Completely. Well,
Yeah.
if I mean, if you look at it, what we see is you've got like the kind of the startups and then the corporates, the bigger
Yeah.
companies. So the startups, you know, they can have very fixed views on this to either localize it or have one package across the world. But I think as soon as you start to scale beyond 500,000 people, you need a more sophisticated, nuanced approach.
Yeah.
For the large corporates, it really depends whether they're a centralized organization or a decentralized organization. But even so, I mean, if you start with, for example, compliance, look at the social security alone, never mind payroll tax. Social security can vary, can be nearly like half your salary in certain countries, and it can be 0% in others. So
Pensions. Yeah.
why should you not localize the package? Now, at the same time, you need to have a degree of equity and fairness in your pay package is absolutely vital. But I think, you know, having a one size fits all, and certainly in the large companies, we don't see that. We tend to see that, sure, just even for tax reasons alone, you need to have a more nuanced approach. But I think it's a good point because, you know, in expats, they were kind of, in the senior executives, they were treated on an ad hoc case by case basis. You can't do that when you're rolling this out for, you know, tens of thousands of employees.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah, John, I apologize. We didn't get a chance to talk about what you guys do at Work From Anywhere. Maybe tell us a little bit about that. And then I'd love to talk about some of the other trends that you see kind of around the companies that are getting it right.
Yeah.
What are some of the commonalities there that people maybe can pick up on and learn from? Because I think you have a good point there about that small business, bigger business. I think the little guys today always have to fail much faster. And they have to fail hopefully smaller because they don't have the budgets and the time, the runway to be failing big. So I think there's a dynamic there, but I'm just curious tell us everybody what you guys do. I know, but I want to share it and then what you guys see.
So for us, it kind of all started a couple of years ago where we could see people in HR were tearing their hair out because people were requesting the ability to work in a different country for a few days or weeks or months a year. And they're like, how am I going to assess all these risks? I've got payroll tax, social security, permanent establishment, immigration, right to work. I really struggle. And then, of course, the different solutions. Sometimes it's maybe a digital nomad visa for a shorter term trip of less than a year. Maybe it's a structural scenario that maybe it's an employer of record or maybe it's a legal entity or independent contractor. So it's so mind-numbingly confusing. So we said, okay, well, could we build an algorithm that would automate this in seconds for both temporary remote work, like workations, and also like structural remote work, hire from anywhere. And initially we were the only ones really doing this in the world. And so, of course, you're a new product. Our company's going to want to be using this. We're quite nervous. But more or less in the last 2 years, we've onboarded Fortune 500 companies all around the world and startups and won multiple awards in the last couple of months. So I would say probably 80% of companies are coming to us primarily for the workation piece of it, because that's the big need for big companies now. And maybe 20-25% are coming from more the hire from anywhere piece. So the hire from anywhere is like, I want to hire 2 engineers in Indonesia. What's the model? Is it legal entity, employer of record, or contractor? And so what we tend to see is that companies are really getting so many of these requests primarily for workations from employees. And they're like, well, how do I deal with this? I can't keep going to my tax advisors all the time. Or maybe if they're conservative, I can't keep saying no. And that's where they need the technology to be able to facilitate a program like that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very cool. But what are some of the trends you guys are kind of seeing, beyond what we've already talked about, like around just with the customers that you're working with that are getting this right, if you will?
The companies that are getting this right have got clear accountability and responsibility for who's in charge. And that's probably what makes this a bit of a unique problem in lots of ways, because some of our customers, it's the payroll team, the payroll operations team. Sometimes it's HR director. Sometimes it's the global mobility team. Others, it's the corporate tax team. Sometimes it's the immigration team. And what you tend to see, a general trend, is nobody wants to take ownership of this because A, they need budget, and they're going to get these requests. They're going to manage it. So
you know what that sounds like in my experience? It ends up in payroll
That's
somehow.
what I was just going to say, the same
Yeah.
thing.
Oh,
Payroll.
nobody wants to do something? Oh,
people
yeah.
are,
Payroll
people are
will
like,
deal with it.
people are like, I'm gone, I'm out of here. And
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Compliance. Yeah.
So even though a lot of companies knew this was an issue and knew this was a benefit that made sense, like everyone was tearing their hair out going, I don't want this. I don't want to be dealing with this. So I think it really was, like people kicking and screaming, I would say, probably from the middle of last year, we really started to see things taking off. And there's different maturities, different industries. Like you can see, obviously, like companies in, for example, the software engineering industries, for example, marketing agencies, like they were first out the gate. But then, for example, this year, you've got the companies like manufacturing companies, companies like insurance companies, kind of companies that we work with. It really varies. We have like retailers like Lidl. We have, FMCG companies like a Reckitt, for example. We have companies like NXP, makers parts for the iPhone. We have a wide range of different companies in UK, mainland Europe, US, Asia, Latin America. I would say as a general trend that the US and Europe are farther ahead in this in terms of being an employee benefit. Then I would say followed by Asia and LATAM. Really don't see much of a pull from this in Africa, if I'm honest yet. We do see isolated cases. We see a lot of requests and cases within Europe and also in US, combination of interstate, but also international. What is fascinating about the US, from what we can see, is that if you look at work from anywhere as a benefit, and work from anywhere, let's define what that is. Work from anywhere is saying, look, there's 220 countries in the world. Straight away, there's 100 we're never going to be allowed because there's war going on there, sanctions, whatever it is. Just too high risk. But that leaves us with maybe 100, 120 or so, 150 that we say we're willing to consider. For those countries, we're going to allow X number of days. And so what we then see happen is that in the case of the US, that's where it gets very interesting, because typically, what's PTO in the US? 10, 15 days a year? But if you can say to somebody, you know what, you can go back and visit your family or your friends in Indonesia for, maybe 30 days a year, that's a very interesting employee benefit. That creates a lot of stickiness,
Flexibility enablers. The more flexibility enablers that you can offer, the better that employee is going to be able to shape their experience.
Exactly.
Hey, John,
go ahead.
Is there a scale for this, right? Like, so, even very small employers right now are recognizing not only that they might have to have somebody outside of the US that's there with them, but that they might have these situations crop up. And oftentimes solutions are really only scalable beyond a certain threshold.
It's a great question. So what it looks like is, you've got three components of any well-run process. You've got the policy, so your written policy, how you do it, and I can walk you through that. You then have the people, be it your internal people and stakeholders or external advisors, and the technology piece. So if we start with the policy, you need to have very clear rules around what countries you're going to allow. You need to have a traffic light system. So, for example, red countries, forget it. We're never going to allow it. You're going to have green countries, maybe where we've got a legal entity below a certain number of days. That's pretty much automatic as long as they've got the right to work and visa. And then you have orange countries. That's where you need to assess on a case by case. That's where you're going to need the technology piece of it. For the actual implementation of the policy, what's first and foremost is that what we tend to see best practice, companies will never allow requests unless an employee has signed off on the policy, which typically says you need to check immigration, visa, for example, and you need to check right to work. Then it typically goes up to the manager. If the manager says, no, it's not going to work, well, then it dies there. If it gets approved, that's where it goes into the global mobility, the HR, the payroll team. And that's typically where they use technology. What kind of technology do they use? 3 different types. Excel, used by most, believe it or not, because especially if they have less than 20, 30 cases, they don't need a fancy technology platform. Now, next bit is if you have a lot of cases, if you've got, let's say, more than 20, 30, or 50, you can't keep going to your tax advisors or ignoring the risk. It's a lot of work to do it. And that's where you've got a choice between, I would say, oil tankers or speedboats. Both equally, some companies have a lot of cases, like tens of thousands of cases. Well, then maybe full automation, that might work for you. It'll cost more, but it'll work. Others, it might be more of a speedboat. And again, speedboat, plug and play, it'll do exactly what you need, but then you'll have your own process engineering workflows in your own ERP system or like a Workday. So that's kind of the landscape of what we tend to see for companies and how they go about it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Awesome.
Do you think that I mean, when you think about it, is maybe part of the problem that this is too much of a bottoms up pull and not enough of a meet in the middle? Leadership saying, "Hey, we want to be strategic about our talent. We want to be more, broader with how we're opening our channels. And oh, by the way, we've got this demand, so let's meet in the middle and figure this out." Or do you think it's more of the employees are still trying to pull? Please let me do this. Please let me have that.
Yeah,
Um, you know,
combination of factors. On the one hand, work from anywhere is basically below the hierarchy of domestic remote work. So companies
yeah,
figuring out what is their domestic remote work policy. That's been one of the challenges. A lot of companies haven't settled on that. So how can they settle on work from anywhere if they haven't figured out their domestic remote work policy as well? So we are
yeah,
seeing that's beginning. I know there's RTO coming up a lot. But the data from Nick Bloom and many others, Castle data, tells us it really hasn't changed. People, they can be as many RTOs as you want, but people are still living their lives the same way as we have been living the last year and a half. But I think it does come back to it that part of it is just measuring the data. If you can see the data that we're losing people because of this, then you're at least empowered to be able to make the right decision. So asking, like in
yeah,
your exit interviews, did you leave because of the lack of a work from home policy? If you don't ask it, well, then you're never
Yeah.
going to find out.
No. Yeah.
yeah. In you had that great blog. I think it was titled how work from anywhere policy can drive business growth and innovation. You just recently
Yeah,
published that.
that's right. Yeah.
And in there you talked about this issue. I think you brought up earlier about the ROI,
Yeah.
people not measuring that. Do you think that some of that is that it's just too, I don't know, soft? Right?
Well,
Like maybe they think retention or maybe they're not even thinking retention. Maybe they're not even thinking engagement. They're just more thinking, oh, I can't put a hard dollar value to this, so there's no ROI, or which is short sighted. But
yeah, it's a good
yeah,
question. So I think when we look at it, some people think, hold on a second, this is so immensely complex, I can't even
yeah,
wrap my head around it. Other times it might be their corporate tax team that says, you know what, we just don't feel comfortable about the risk. But the part of the challenge there is that too often when people think about rolling out a work from home policy, think, oh, listen, the compliance risk is too much. But the problem is yeah, that's absolutely a risk, but there's also the risk of losing talent. That
yeah.
has a clear business cost. You
Or
can
never getting them in the first place.
never
Yeah,
getting them. Exactly. So when we talk about risk, when I'm speaking to C-suites and the leaders, payroll leaders, I say, look, measure risk holistically. I don't have the right answer whether you should do it for your company, for whether you should do a work from your program, but at least measure risk holistically. If you're a bank,
yeah,
maybe having a very limited work from your program is perfect. But maybe if you're into software engineering, in the software space, you need to be pushing it. And so when we talk about measuring that, things like exactly like you mentioned, the percentage of job offers rejected due to a lack of a policy. Do we measure
yeah,
that? What about employee satisfaction? What about employee engagement? People that did request to work for an hour trip or not. What about employee attrition? So don't just focus on the obvious compliance costs. Focus
yeah,
on these other costs, and they're not soft. They're hard measures we can measure that have a
yeah,
have a big impact,
yeah. And
particularly employee attrition.
yeah, agreed. And I think I mean, obviously on the front end, there's that quality of hire, speed to hire, right?
Yeah,
And I think even on the back end, you're right. You can look at some outcomes. It would take some time, but you can gather some outcomes on the retention, the engagement, the ability to have more
yeah.
applicants at all, candidates at all. I think there's a boost to all of those things. So I think you're right. There's almost like do you almost have a scorecard, right, model for
Yeah,
for
well,
remote work?
yeah, we absolutely do. But it's also what's really interesting is two key drivers are
Yeah,
your industry sector and your risk appetite, your compliance risk appetite. So what we find is that in your industry sector, if your competitors are not offering a work from anywhere as a benefit, you can still do it. It might be a massive employee benefit, but you're not going to have a huge push
yeah,
because at least you're able to say to your employees, look, we're in a highly regulated banking industry. No one's doing it. They're all 5 days return to office. Leave me alone. But if your competitors are doing it, well, clearly, you're going to be leaking talent if you don't. The other side of it is your compliance risk appetite. So within an industry sector, looking at what is your risk appetite? How do you see it? Are you conservative or do you feel like you're happy to take on more risk? That needs to come from the C-suite. That needs to come from all of the different cross-functional stakeholders coming together to go, okay, we see it as a benefit. How far are we willing to push it? For example, do you want to maybe offer a 30-day work from anywhere policy? Or maybe do you want to go up to as far as maybe an Airbnb or a Spotify, or let's say Airbnb does like 90 days work from anywhere. for example. So
Oh, wow.
we actually
Nice.
see, even in the banking industry, we see some of the technology, the companies like the Revolut and whatnot, they do like up to 90 days, whereas maybe the traditional banks, they don't do it at all. So it's fascinating even within an industry, and it's linked to the risk appetite.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. I mean, we talked a little bit about the cultural, I guess you could say, sort of lens around the world, but like, do you see any commonalities in the companies that are winning with this? Is it the high tech guys, companies, whatever, that
No,
are only benefiting, or do you
no,
see any
absolutely
other
not.
characteristics?
No, no, absolutely not. I mean, I would say of our clients around the world, we probably have, I don't know, maybe 20% are technology companies, but there's
Yeah.
like 80% are not. So
Wow.
we find that the companies that are actually doing this well is, again, clear ownership, a very clear policy, and they're measuring this stuff, and they have a clear understanding of how far they're willing to go with this. But I think what's also vital is they're communicating it, they're marketing it well. I would
Hmm.
go back to the Airbnb example. Literally the month after they launched their policy, their careers page went from, I think, below 500,000 visitors to, I think, 900,000. Like it nearly
Yep.
doubled, it's
Wow.
nearly a million.
Probably the quality of
Like
people too
like
boosted as well.
what the quality of people coming in. I mean, it actually was so successful. They turned, like, they practically had a whole business unit built around this. They could see it actually. You know what? These longer term stays that remote workers are doing is massive. Now, I think, one of the things I will say as well is we've also got to be honest on what exactly it is as well. So, like digital nomads that move around country to country, sorry, that's never going to work for a company. You can employ them ad hoc as a contractor every now and again for skills, but people that are moving every month, that's never going to work. So you've got to be honest with people
Yeah.
up front. So the companies that are doing this well have that very clear and say, look, here's what we offer, here's how many days, and here's the approach that we take with it. So the expectations are very clear up front.
Yeah. Kind of going along that lines, I mean, do you think there's this sort of, and I would say this is probably more of an enterprise thing. Julie, you've probably seen this, but like, look here we go. In my day, it was always, these were expats, right? I've managed big populations of expats in my remit. And I felt like we were very reactive, obviously just sort of doing whatever the, HR sort of sent to us and legal had worked out. As payroll, you're kind of downstream. But I think now more than ever, it's almost like, do you need and is it just simply the global mobility team that is sort of the heart of this, that is controlling and making sure, if you will, matrix managing across the organization to make sure that HR and payroll and legal and everyone is in lockstep with making this happen? Do you see that sort of evolving
Yeah,
at
well,
all?
it's we tend to see different owners in different companies. Payroll have a huge role to play in this.
Yeah.
Rewards, because of the employee benefit piece of this, huge role to play. Global mobility, huge role to play. For me, I will say, I do get frustrated very often when payroll people, rewards leaders, yeah, global mobility leaders, they say,
Yeah.
you know what, I want a seat at the table. I want a seat at the table. Well, then fucking measure the ROI, measure the
Yeah.
data,
Yeah.
have the
Yeah.
data so you can elevate. I was companies again. I've spoken to some isolated cases where we're doing RTO, and I said, well, why didn't you measure the data? You could have measured the data when you had a policy in place to
Yeah.
show the impact of this. So for me, I'm a big believer in payroll and rewards and mobility having a role at the table. I think
Yeah.
it's such a powerful, such a very influential role in such a positive way. Those
Yeah.
example I spoke about the grandfather in South Africa, like that's so special. But let's think about how we can measure the ROI to be able to have the data, to be able to have that seat at the table.
Yeah. Julie, you poke around in the shared services world. Do you see enterprises beefing up their global mobility teams? Is it still a global mobility sort of remit in terms of owning it all around?
I'll tell you what, because it has always been that top 1% or less, right? It
Yeah.
it really
Execs.
isn't the
Yeah.
biggest nut to solve for. It ends up being
Yeah.
a really discrete number of folks that are touching it. You're touching it with a few key vendors that are handling tax or the mobility process itself. And so it's not usually the place that's ripest for opportunity. But I do wonder when I think about shared services, like certainly contact center reps and the contact center
Yeah.
role is evolving incredibly, not only because maybe there are more virtual location. You can do virtual call centers as opposed to a physical building, but also because AI is moving in and taking, potentially. So now can I replace people with how much, right? Of AI generated activity. And it is, something that maybe you can log in and sign in from anywhere. So it does make me think like maybe contact centers as an industry might be something, that has
Yeah.
those types of characteristics to it. um, that's what I see the most. And then I know this probably won't be, too much of a conversation because John, you're in the sticky wicket of the global bit of it. But I work with a number of domestic companies, and quite honestly, the issue is the same. If you're just talking to a domestic company that's trying to deal with, we're
Yep.
an Ohio hospital, and we have somebody that, we want to hire somebody in California or in another state, and there's less complexity, sure, but there's still the same challenges and the same issues that don't have policies and that don't have
Multi-state.
compensation
Yeah.
structures.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, in
Yeah.
the US, it's very much, I probably say 65% of the time, maybe 70% of the time it's domestic, and
Yeah.
maybe 35% varies by company. It's international. It really depends. Yeah.
Yeah, Julie, there's a major, I would say there's a major risk to, there's a lot of folks who have allowed remote work who have, and we saw this during the pandemic, for example, the camper van folks, right? My cousin was one of them, sold his home and his family. They tooled around in a big RV like rock stars and saw the whole country. But that's happening, right? People are working remote and doing things in America, in our 50 states, without Nexus, without telling their employers hey, I'm in Wyoming this month, or I'm in California, and the client is only in New York, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, or whatever, or company. That's an issue. That's a massive risk. I think Topia did some good research on that a while back, and there was a significant number of people were working remote that their employers did not actually know where they were, and
So
they're not meeting the compliance requirements.
two key things to mention on that. You mentioned New York. You mentioned, for example, AI. The New
Yeah.
York State. We actually published an article on this recently. They have reduced the number of tax auditors by 5%, but they increased the tax audit letters by 50%. Again, using AI to do basically risk targeting and then send automated letters out. So I think that's one aspect of it. The other component of it is like also the digitalization of borders. We have the ESTA in the US, but also we're seeing that also in Europe as well. And so, we were thinking like with the pandemic, it was, obviously, businesses getting more digitalized. We see e-commerce go through the roof, et cetera. We see remote work. Yeah, well, guess what? The tax authorities, their immigration authorities, they're well into that as well. So that's something that we do see. And we also see that probably in the first year after the pandemic, there was a lot of hush workations, people not telling their bosses. We have seen, a lot of companies go, hold on a second, we really can't have this. It's been something that cracked down on. Yeah.
I think tech is going to catch up to that. I don't know. Don't quote me on this, but I remember reading recently, there was this, I want to say it was somewhere in Europe. The government's using like a Google Maps type of a view, or aerial photo, I don't know, to find out who has pools in their yards so they can tax. Have you seen that?
That's the one we actually mentioned that in our article as well. The French tax authorities, they basically did a partnership with, I think, IBM and Google Maps, and they took images of all of people's basically houses, and those that had pools that weren't declared, they were able to then send tax. I mean, this was a couple of years ago. So you see, if they're doing that now, like a couple of years ago, what are they going to be doing now?
How far off, right? I mean, because there's a lot of independent contractors that are probably doing things historically that didn't. I worked for the Big Four, and they were all over that, right? Like at Deloitte, I got a W-4 or whatever or two from every state, whatever that is for each state. And that was a big part of year end, was us, declaring all of our earnings and going through our taxes.
But if you look at remote work, you have the temporary and the structural pieces of it. For the temporary remote work, like workations, we see this huge battle going on with digital nomad visas. These countries that are seeing for tourism revenue, wow, this is a big opportunity. And the countries that are seeing people leave them, they're like, hold on a second, we want to stay grabbing onto that. And so trying to create an attachment in some cases, where we can see, for example, in France recently, they're looking at going closer to the American model of citizenship, basically, where there's a risk of even if you leave, for example, being able to being stuck with paying higher taxes. And then on the other hand, you have the likes of employers of record and legislation waiting to catch up on those as well, being very diverse. So there is definitely a sense that the governments have a way to go to catch up on how we're working today.
Well, in companies too, as you mentioned very plainly, employees don't disclose, a lot of times, where they are. I think it would be challenging for my employer to know where I am in what state just because I'm at a conference that they know.
That's a tricky one. That's a very tricky, because what we do see is companies, sometimes we see some cases where they do anonymous VPN pings because they can't, due to privacy, track it down to an individual person, but they also have responsibility to make sure people are safe, duty of care, and also the property is safe. So sometimes we see companies that do a ping and all of a sudden, what the hell, somebody's working in Russia. Well, that's not supposed to be, things like that, for example. So, but it is a tricky balancing act. And I think the legislation around this is very, very tricky. I think companies have to make sure they get the right advice to do it in the right way. Yeah, but it's tricky.
Just thinking about all the engagement you do around the global EOR, global employer of record space, like what are you seeing in that way? Do you think that's meeting the challenge? I mean, I think that's been a huge vehicle to help. Obviously, I'm seeing more of the VMS solutions start to step up and create, better technology. We talked about Workday Venly helping with, direct sourcing. But like, what are you seeing in that way, man? Do you think any insights you're kind of gleaning?
It was really interesting. It started off very much with startups a couple of years ago, primarily with contractors, and then the actual employer of records, adjusting to have that employer of record model within them, for example. And I think corporates in general have still got a ways to catch up. We can see that a lot of the employers of record are staffing up their global mobility account and sales team members, basically to try and go after that corporate space. But in general, we find that with corporates, the bigger corporates, they tend to have very strong kind of talent hubs, and they're happy using that for now. But at the same time, for me, I'm trying as much as I can to educate the large corporates to go, look, having an employer of record there in your back pocket, it's a helpful tool. For some companies, it's not the right cultural fit, but for some, it's very helpful. And a good example, there was a global insurance company I was speaking with only in the last 2 weeks. And I'd been talking to them for years. I said, look, you've got to at least consider this. Of course, then deciding which is the right employer of record for you is the next question, can be very different. There's a lot of variation. But I spoke to them a year ago and I said, you've got to look at this. They said, no, we're happy not looking at this. And then I spoke to them a couple of weeks ago. I said, well, how did you get on since? I said, funny you say that. I had an executive of one of our big divisions, and he said, if I can't fucking hire this person, it's going to cost us $100 million. Get it fucking done. So it's one way to just crack open the nut.
I love it. I love it, man.
It was done 2 weeks later, I bet.
Exactly. Yeah.
So John, just to kind of maybe round this out, man, any sort of inside sauce that you would share as far as maybe the hidden things that people don't realize about getting this to be an enabler to strategy versus maybe just being a burden that we didn't mention yet?
Yeah, no, I think the big one that becomes so clear is that last year for me, it was about advocating for here's how you put together a policy. And we put some thought leadership and white papers and resources up on that. Whereas this year, very much shifting to focus on the data, look at the ROI. Yeah. And for me, it's not about me saying, you need to do work from anywhere or not. It's looking at the data to elevate the role of payroll, of rewards, of global mobility, so you can find out what's best and have those conversations with C-suite and not being afraid to confront them with the data. It's uncomfortable sometimes, but I think looking at the data is where we can then start to really build on, okay, well, based on the data, what is it we're going to do that's right by our employees and right for our company?
John, if somebody asks you, like, what are give me a handful of things and just rattle it off. What kind of data should I be capturing? I know you've mentioned one or two throughout, but
most important one is attrition, and making sure when in exit interviews you capture the right reason codes for your company to be able to capture why people are leaving. The amount of people I speak to that say we're losing a lot of talent because people are saying we don't work on our policy. I say, well, do you measure it? No, we don't. So any company you mention, you can speak to like hundreds more. They'll take the same thing in the vast majority of cases. But then if you do actually have a policy, equally measure it. Measure it to see, do you need to push it more? Maybe you need to be more conservative. You need to pull it back. It all comes back to that data piece of it.
Yeah. And there's no reason not to be using data today. I mean, we are in the data age. Yeah. It's the most valuable thing, on the planet. You can look at our stock market, right? It's not oil anymore. No reason to struggle, right? There's tools, there's help.
Exactly.
And so what's look, I John, I love you, man. I could keep talking, but what's 2025 look for work from anywhere, and how do we get in touch with you guys if folks are looking for help?
So the website is wfa.team. So you can reach us there. Basically, feel free to reach out, connect me on LinkedIn. If you have any questions, always happy to help or share best practices or benchmarks. I think to get in touch, also your local Mercer account manager, they're all around the world. We have a partnership with Mercer. They've been fantastic partners for us over the last year. And for us, I think this year, obviously we've gotten 3 global technology awards in the last couple of months,
Congrats,
which is
man.
fantastic. But I think that and all of the feedback, all the testimonials, it gives us such an opportunity to really shake up the world of benefits and work from anywhere the next year. So we're excited.
Yeah, absolutely. It's awesome, man. I'm excited for you. And look, man, let's stay in touch. Let's maybe we do an update next year. I always appreciate speaking with you, man. I would learn something every time.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Julie and Pete. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Likewise. Take care, everyone.